Hey, it is Zennial Gamer, and today we're going to be talking all about artifacts. So specifically, we're going to talk about where you should farm, how much you should farm of each, what the different sub-properties are and do, which sub-properties should get you excited, which ones you don't care about, what you should roll for, and then when you get a decent artifact, how do you find out which monster to put it on, things like that. So to start off with, there are two different types of artifacts. I think everybody knows this by now. You have your attribute, which is basically like your element, fire, water, wind. And then you have your type, which is your attack, your support, your HP monsters, things like that. There are two artifact dungeons. Steel Fortress, which we're in right now, drops the attribute artifacts, and then the Punisher's Crypt will drop the type. So I'm going to tell you at the start, I know Steel Fortress for most people is a more difficult dungeon, but you are going to want to farm the two dungeons about equally. Now with that said, you don't necessarily need to farm the dungeons a lot unless you're in the later stages of the game. In the earlier stages of the game, your primary focus should be about advancing in PvE progression. You only use so many monsters in PvE, and the little bit of shades of difference between like a great artifact and an okay artifact, they don't matter all that much in PvE. The biggest benefits you're really getting in PvE are the base stats. Now, the cool thing about artifacts is that they're going to have the same base stats, the flat attack, flat defense, flat HP, no matter whether or not, if it's a rare, it's a hero, if it's a legend, it doesn't matter. So this artifact that we have right in front of us, this blue artifact, if I take it to plus 15, I get 100 flat attack. If it were legend and I took it to plus 15, I would get 100 flat attack. So the ability to put an extra 200 attack on your monsters is huge for PvE purposes. Now, some artifacts do have better sub-properties, and we're going to go through all of them later, but just right now when we're talking about PvE, anything that allows you to do more damage is going to be good for PvE. But in most cases, it's not going to make a huge difference. That 200 flat attack makes more difference than almost any sub-properties that you're going to get, unless it's just an absolutely amazing lucky roll artifact. So to that point, if you're in the earlier stages of game, if you're looking at PvE progression, you should farm the artifact dungeons for a few days until your PvE monsters have good enough artifacts, but you don't need to farm them extensively until we're working on our PvP teams. Now there's two approaches you can take. So in the past, we had the ability to kind of farm all of the dungeons about equally, or we could just specialize by farming one dungeon above all else. So for example, if you wanted to have the best possible Swift runes because you play a cleave game, you would spend all your time in Giants. If you wanted to have lots of depth and be really good at Siege, for example, you would divide up between the three dungeons equally. I took the latter path. Both paths are good. Both paths have their value. So as we go forward, there's still kind of that same thing for the dungeons. Like if you want just amazing Swift or amazing Violent runes, you're going to spend most of your dungeon farming time in one dungeon. But now we're going to add in the artifacts as well. So basically we have 6 dungeons. We have our 5 in Kairos, plus we have our Rift Raid, our R5. So if you're building your PvE teams, you're going to need to divide your time between those 6. Now, complicating matters a little bit is that we're all starved for mana right now. One thing I do want to point out is that the mana crunch is not going to stay like this forever. We're starved for mana right now simply because we've got so much new content to deal with all at once. However, in a few months, our runes have all been upgraded, and our standard for runes are going to be much higher, so we're not going to be rolling out every rune that drops. We're just going to be looking for better runes. We're going to have most of our monster depth, like your deep monster box, most of those monsters will have some sort of artifact on them, and you're probably not going to be worried about doing a 2% upgrade to the artifact of your 100th monster in your box, right? So the mana crunch is going to go away in a few months. But in the interim, right now, we need to really be balancing out how much raiding we're doing and how much artifact we're doing with how much dungeons we're doing, simply to make sure we have enough mana to deal with everything. So for the short term, I would say that you should probably be doing all 6 of the dungeons about equally, about 15% each. But in the long term, as in the past, you're probably going to want to do a little bit more R5. If you're in, the later stages of the game, you're probably going to want to do something like 25% to 30% R5, 25 to 30% artifacts, and then the rest dungeon farming. Whatever you need to do in order to balance out your mana so that you can continue to use all of the rune enhancements and artifacts that you're getting from those other two dungeons where you make less mana. So in the new B12s, we do make a lot more mana per hour, especially once you've gone through a few months and upgraded all of the runes on your monster box. And your standards are just going to be super crazy high going forward because the drops are so insane. So now that we've talked about the balance between how you should farm, let's talk about when you're actually farming in the artifact dungeons. What are you looking for? Well, to start off with, so far, obviously getting a legend is always better than getting a rare, for example. But the range of rolls on the sub-properties is really, really wide. So let's just use the one that just popped up right now. This is a max roll crit rate of, increasing effect because the range is between 3 and 6. This is a mid-roll damage received under inability because the range is between 1 and 3. Now, min-roll on damage received under ability is 1. So it's not just about the ranges, it's also about the ratios. And I know this is going to sound like kind of complicated math, but just to simplify it, if I started with an artifact, a legend artifact that had damage received under inability and it was min roll, and I quad rolled min roll, I'd be at +5. If I started with a rare that had +3, the max roll, and I just rolled max one more time, I'd be at +6. So it is literally possible to have a rare artifact at +3 that has more value in it than a legend artifact at +12. The rolls matter so much more on artifacts. So with that said, our concern is not necessarily the drop rate. Obviously, legend artifacts have higher potential, partly because you can quad roll. So if you're looking for, obviously one of the best sub-properties is crit damage, right? So if you're looking for this huge crit damage boost for your Lucian, he's going to have an opportunity to get more crit damage from a legend artifact than from a rare. But again, max roll is +6. You can get 18 crit damage on your skill 3 from a rare artifact. Min roll is +3. A legend could quad roll and give you +15, where a rare could double roll and give you +18. So it comes down so much more to how the runes are enchanted than it does to their value. And that's why I've said in previous videos, and I'm going to say again, it is totally all right to farm lower than level 10. If you don't have a stable team that can do PC10 or SF10, do SF9, do PC9, do PC8, do PC7, it doesn't matter. Do whatever level you have that you can do stable and reasonably fast. Now, in addition to looking for artifacts that roll well, we also want artifacts that synergize. So let's look at the type artifacts for a moment. Type comes in each of the different monster types. So for example, attack, HP, and defense monster types. Well, if you have an attack type artifact, then you still can have one of 3 different flat stats on it. It can be HP, defense, or attack. Now, a lot of attack type monsters will benefit from having an extra 1500 HP. It's never a bad thing to have more HP. But most attack type monsters are built to do as much attack as possible. The other thing to consider is that your attack type monsters are probably attacking the enemy's defense or HP type monsters. The enemy's HP monster is probably using an HP artifact with an extra 1500 HP. So you need to do an extra 1500 damage to balance out their 1500 HP. So generally speaking, with your attack type artifacts, you're going to want to have plus attack on them. And again, if it has amazing sub properties, then it doesn't mean you automatically get rid of it. But when we're talking about the ideal fit, attack type artifacts with flat attack on them, there's inherent value in that because a huge portion of the benefit of artifacts comes from the flat stats. Now, if we're talking about an HP artifact, you can go with either HP or defense to have inherent value. There's more value in HP because it works really well on HP bruiser types. But if you're just talking about a monster that's kind of there to survive and doesn't necessarily scale on HP, then a defense flat is okay. Remember also that not every monster in the game is classified the way we might choose to classify them. So a monster like Perna, I believe, is an HP type. And giving Perna flat defense is really helpful because Perna's defense is so low that it's hard to give her defense. So if you give Perna an extra 50% defense, that's only 150. If you give Perna an HP artifact, but it's got 100 flat defense on it, that's a huge boost proportionate. it's like a huge percentage boost of Perna's base defense. It's more than a third of Perna's base defense. So first thing we're looking for on our type artifacts are the flat stats that synergize. Second thing we're looking for are flat stats that enhance or amplify. So Perna's defense is the example there. If you have a monster with crazy low base stats in one area, then the monster may actually benefit more, because we're talking about a flat stat here. The monster may actually benefit more by having that stat boosted up. Now, it depends on if you expect the monster to use that stat. So for example, Lucian, if your Lucian is getting hit, then something is wrong. Like when you cleave with Lucian, the odds are that you're supposed to be killing everything on the enemy side. He doesn't need defense. On the other hand, your Perna is going to get hit. Since your Perna is going to get hit, then that defense benefits your Perna, and then there's value in that flat defense. Now, with sub-properties, keyword of the day here again is synergy. We're looking for sub-properties that are going to synergize with the monster it's being put on, but we're also looking for sub-properties that are going to help us accomplish a goal and synergize with each other. Now, with that said, there are so many different sub-properties, and every rune can have a different type of flat attack, or, every rune can have a different kind of flat stat. It's virtually, I don't want to say impossible, but the math behind it is that you could farm for probably years before you got the perfect artifact the way you would design it. So there's always going to be some trade-offs. And in that case, what we're really looking to do is try to work backwards. We're going to take the artifact we have and find the monster that it best fits on, as opposed to taking a monster and saying, this is what I need in my artifact. So what we're looking for when we farm for artifacts is we're looking for quality artifacts that we can envision going somewhere, and then we're going to try and find the best place to put those artifacts. And that leads us to the attribute artifacts. Now with attribute, there's not necessarily, you can't have flat attack to go with an attack type, because it's just attribute, right? So there are HP and support and defense and all those types of monsters of every attribute. So instead what we're looking for is for the flat stat to synergize with the sub-properties. So if you have an artifact that gives you lots of damage reduction, then obviously that artifact is going to be best if it's HP or defense. If you have an artifact that gives you lots of additional damage, then obviously that artifact is going to be best if it's got flat attack. The damage dealt by element and the damage reduction by element is what you have on the attribute type. So that's the easiest way to remember. Your attribute is going to have elemental damage manipulations, either more or less. Your type artifacts are where you get your boosted crit damage, or your boosted recovery, or your boosted accuracy. So if attributes are elemental damage manipulation, then type artifacts are skill effect manipulation. On the type artifacts, the crit damage boost is obviously the most desirable. The recovery boost is also really, really valuable. Monsters like Anavel or Chasun or Triana, Harmonia, all of them, that recovery percentage, if you can get a big multi-roll recovery percentage, it makes a huge difference. Crit damage is going to be amazing on your nukers, monsters like Lucian or the Rauks that we have on screen, or the Pang we have on screen. Anybody who does a lot of damage is going to benefit significantly from crit damage. The time that you really have to make a decision is if you have a monster that spans both bridges. So think of Vigor. Vigor is both a healer and a nuker. And at that point, you have to ask yourself, how have I built my Vigor and what role do I want him to serve? Is he built just as a pure tank and doesn't do a lot of damage? Or maybe he doesn't have a lot of accuracy, so he's not giving you a defense break. In that case, you might focus on the recovery boost. Is he built as an all-out nuker? He's in a crit damage build, lots of HP, crit damage, crit rate, all of that. Then you might focus on the crit damage. And then the tiebreaker for that, if you're not sure which way to go, it could be the flat stat. Is it on a flat stat HP? Maybe you have recovery on a flat stat HP and you have crit damage on a flat stat attack. Well, that crit damage on the flat stat attack, that should go on a monster who scales off attack. So then you can use the recovery on the HP for your Vigor. So at the end of the day, one of the biggest things about artifacts is going to be just finding the right artifacts for how you use your monsters. A lot of times, monsters can use more than one artifact. There's more than one artifact that will enhance their skills, but it's a question of how do you use them in the types of comps that you build and things like that. Now, in addition to the sub-properties that you can get from type and attribute, there are a bunch of common subproperties that are shared on both. So first of all, we have attack, defense, or speed increased proportional to lost HP up to N%. So imagine if you get a 10% attack boost proportional to lost HP. Well, if you've lost 40% of your HP, then that 10% boost means you've got, 4% more attack because it's proportional. So I don't tend to value the proportional lost HP on attack all that much, because the monster by design, if it's a monster that's doing a lot of damage that scales off of attack, then it's probably kind of squishy, and if it's taking a lot of damage, then it's more likely to die. But I might value, for example, the increased defense if it's a bruiser. So just as one example, Skogul. Putting increased defense or increased speed on a Skogul who's going to be a primary target can be really beneficial, because it allows your Skogul to live just that much longer or to cycle back to his rock that much faster. So with this particular subproperty, what we're looking for is something that synergizes, but for the most part, this is a subproperty I'm not going to value much unless it heavily multi-rolls, or unless it just very specifically fits one of a small handful of monsters. Increased speed proportional lost HP, that's going to be really good for your support types. It's going to be good for your healers, preferably healers that you use in a tanky build. So monsters, like I like to bring in, for example, Chasun against fire monsters, use my Chasun to tank. So getting additional speed based on lost HP would help her turn cycle even more. Now the next series of subproperties we have are increase attack, defense, speed, and crit rate effect. What it's actually saying is that the beneficial effect that's cast on you as a spell is going to be increased. The effect of that effect is going to be increased by a certain percentage. So for example, a crit rate boost is going to increase your critical rate 30%. Now, if you have increased crit rate effect by 10%, then you get 10% more benefit from the crit rate boost. Then you're getting a 33% additional crit rate instead of a 30% additional crit rate. So for the crit rate effect, that to me pretty much only has value for a monster that self-buffs crit, because then you can reliably build the monster around that. If the monster does not self-buff crit, then I really don't see value. Even if you consistently use that monster in a comp with a crit buffer, you still kind of have to build the other monster with the extra crit rate. Now conversely, increasing attack or defense effect, these have a lot of value, because first of all, there's a lot of attack buffers, and we run attack buffers in a lot of our comps. And being able to do more damage and reliably count on that is a big deal. So for example, you might have an Odin who does, big damage, ignore defense scales to attack, or you might have your Rauks that we have going right behind us, or twins, or any monster that does big damage and scales to attack. They're going to get a lot of value from that increased effect from the attack buff. On the other hand, there are a lot of monsters that scale big damage to defense. Some of them ignore defense, some don't. So for example, Bulldozer and Copper, they do defense scaling damage and ignore. Tyrannus doesn't ignore, but he just does tons of damage. Same thing for a Veligul. So for all of those monsters, if you consistently run them in defense buffing comps, then there is a lot more value in getting the increased defense buff. Now, for increased speed effect, that again, it's somewhere in between, because there's a lot of value in, it's a speed meta, right? So being able to, the faster you can be in any way you can make yourself faster is always going to be valuable. So being able to get more effect from your speed buff, that's helpful. But there aren't that many viable speed buffing monsters. So most of the time when you're running your comps, it's pretty rare that you're going to be running with a speed buffer. Off the top of my head, Savannah, who not a lot of people have, Kali, who's in a pretty much straight cleave type comp, and you're usually not going to be benefiting that much from her speed buff. Hraesvelg, the Wind Barbarian King, and there's a couple of others, but there's just not that many monsters in the meta that give speed buff, partly because it makes it harder to speed tune, and that's really complicated for people. So what I would say is that anytime you can get increased speed effect on a monster that does its own speed buff, there's a lot of value in that. Now, damage dealt by counterattack is one of the ones that I personally value the least. If you could put that on Fen Yang, it would be amazing. I don't have a Fen Yang. There are very few monsters in the game that counterattack. Now, of course, this works on Revenge runes as well, but unless you're running triple Revenge, the counterattack rate is just so low. So there are very, very few monsters in the game that counterattack. Most of the ones that do, the counterattack is fairly not 100%. So Leica, obviously Leica is going to counterattack, but at a 50% rate. Miho's going to counterattack at 190% rate. No, I mean, obviously, a monster like Miho is going to benefit huge for additional damage on counterattack, but it's just there are so few of them that, again, it's the type of thing where you can hold out for that amazing quad roll and you don't necessarily have to settle or compromise. Damage dealt by attacking together, it's basically twins and Rauks, or twins and Inigamis. Obviously, a couple of the other Inigamis have team up as well. But again, same thing as what I just talked about with counterattack. There are so few monsters in the game that benefit from this, you can be really selective. And then bomb damage, once again, same thing. So a lot of these sub-properties, I'm going to keep saying same thing, because, and this is by design, by the way. Com2uS wanted to make us use our artifacts intelligently, so they gave us a lot of different sub-properties so that we would have to find the best fits for them, which is, to me personally, it's a cool system. I actually really like it. But it does mean that a lot of artifacts are going to have more limited use. So things like bomb damage or life drain, both of those, you could really just hold out for the most amazing versions of those artifacts that you get because there are so few monsters where it matters for them. Now, HP when revived, I find no value in this one whatsoever. For the demons, you actually do not want them to have extra HP. When I say demons, I'm talking about Belial and Beelzebub. You do not want them to have extra HP simply because their damage scales based on their HP status. Perna already revives at 100%, and there aren't, Odin can revive at 100%. There aren't that many self-revivers, and most of the ones that do self-revive aren't really in the meta. And if they're in the meta, then that extra few percent of HP is not going to make much difference. So unless you're actually running a pre-configured comp that runs with like an Eladriel or an Amarna where you're sacrificing a monster intentionally, there's just no value in it. And even if there is value, the range, the 1 to 3% range, it's so low that you're better off looking for a different sub-property that better benefits you. Now, damage dealt by Reflect. Again, there's only a handful of monsters in the game that will benefit from this. Sonora, Ragdoll, if you happen to have Ragdoll, but there's not that many. Joltan also, this was confirmed in the comments of the last artifact video I did. Joltan does reflect damage through his passive, so he's a monster that definitely you do want to get this kind of artifact on. One of the very few monsters I might actually consider upgrading incrementally. Now, the next set is another one that really does confuse people, and this one's kind of an important one. It's additional damage by N% of HP, attack, defense, or speed. Now, additional damage means it's flat damage. It's basically like ignored defense damage. So we're just going to use really easy numbers here and say you have additional damage by 100% of speed, and your speed is 300. That means you're going to do an extra 300 damage every hit. So this grouping, the additional damage by N% of whatever, this grouping, where it truly benefits people is on multi-hitters. So think of an Abigail who does 8 hits on her skill 2. Now, of course, your Abigail won't be 300 speed, so let's use a more realistic one and say 200. Your Abigail's 200 speed, and she's got 100% boost bonus damage per attack. That means she's doing 200 damage extra per attack on all 8 hits. That's an extra 1,600 damage. That is much more significant. Monsters like Shihu, monsters like Stella, any monster that's doing multi-hits, even monsters like Twins, because they're turn cycling each other and most of them are multi-hitters, all of them are going to benefit significantly more from additional damage than a single hit monster. This is really linear. So if you have a monster like Pang that I have on screen, and you give Pang additional, let's again, we're just going to go easy numbers. Let's say my Pang hits for 10,000 damage. If I can give my Pang an extra 5% damage on fire, then Pang does an extra 500 damage. If I can give Pang an extra 5% damage by her attack, she's only doing an extra 100 damage. So the 5% damage on fire was more valuable for Pang. Now let's give Abigail the same thing. She does 10,000 damage. 5% damage to fire is 500, but 5% attack, if that same thing is 200 damage, and she does 8 hits, it's 1,600. So where a monster like Pang gets a lot more value from having direct damage on an attribute, a monster like Abigail gets a lot more value from having additional damage by N% per hit. Now this does bring me back to one point that I forgot to mention earlier, which is on your attribute artifacts, when we look at the damage dealt on and damage received from, make sure it synergizes. So if you have a water monster, or if you have a water artifact and it says you receive less damage from fire, it's kind of a who cares thing, because fire monsters don't attack water monsters anyway. It makes the particular artifact less value. Okay, now the next couple that we have on this list are going to be damage received under inability effects and speed under inability effects. It's kind of hard for me to know exactly how to value this. I've been using some of them. I don't run away from them, but I'm not super excited about them either. My basic philosophy here is that if my team has been disabled, I'm already probably in trouble. And these things can help me quite a bit, but I don't think they're going to be enough of a difference maker to be worth the opportunity cost of other sub-properties I may be giving up. I think it's kind of nice to have, for example, speed under inability as an extra sub-property, but not your primary one. Now, crit damage received, I definitely actively chase. Crit damage received, crit damage dealt by attribute, and recovery percentage. Those are the 4 things that I look for the most. And then after that, it would be increased damage by N% of attack, but because there's fewer multi-hitters, that becomes my 5th. And then the last one on the chart here is crushing hit damage. And for me, the only monster in the game right now that exists that I have that matches that description is Gemini. So literally one artifact, and I could put some extra crushing hit damage on my Gemini to give me a better chance to kill Mihos. And that's it. Like, there's a couple of other skills in the game, I think, that give you a guaranteed crushing hit, but for the most part, any monster that's built to do damage is built with high crit rate. And then I just realized I jumped over attack bar when revived, so that's actually the last one. And I'll just say that while it's nice, I've tested it a little bit. I really haven't noticed any difference whatsoever with my Beelzebub. He still gets cut just as often as he used to if the enemy is already at 100% attack bar. I feel like you're going to need basically a max quad roll on this thing because it's a 1 to 3 range, right? I feel like you need at least like 15% attack bar for it really to have any impact whatsoever. And then the impact is going to be so rare, it will not have ever been worth remotely giving up things like bonus crit damage or damage reductions or anything like that. So for attack bar when revived to be effective, it needed to be a much higher range. It needed to be more like, I don't know, 4 to 8% maybe, because you really, I mean, you're going to need to have like 30% attack bar when revived minimum to make it worth the opportunity cost of what you're giving up on some of the other sub-properties. But a lot of this goes to balancing, and I do personally believe that Com2uS is going to continue to tweak and balance artifacts. It's a brand new system, so today attack bar when revived isn't worthwhile, but a few months down the road, if they do some tweaks and rebalancing to artifacts and they change that range to 4 to 8%, it definitely could have its place in the game then. Okay, so we've just got a couple of topics left that I want to discuss. The second to last one is basically how do you know which artifacts to keep and how do you know which artifacts to invest mana into? So if you've been watching in the background, you'll notice that I probably kept a lot of artifacts that may not have looked very good. This has been my own personal process. I can't tell you it's better or worse, it's just what I'm doing. Because the artifacts are kind of complicated, and when I'm farming, I'm usually not paying a whole lot of attention to the game. What I do is just take a quick look. If an artifact stands out as total garbage, I sell it. So if it's I see like +1/+1, and it's a rare +1/+1, I sell it. And if I cannot tell on a quick look that it's garbage, then I just hit OK. And I farm artifacts for a while, and when I've got about, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 of them, I put aside a couple of hours and I go through each artifact one by one and I check the rolls and I spend more time with them to figure out if they're good or not. And if it looks like the artifact has any potential at all, I roll it to +3 and then I check it again. And then I roll it to +6 and I check it again. And then +9 and check it again. And If it still looks like it's good when it gets to +9, then I find somebody, I go out and I check and see if there's somebody I can put it on. And we're going to talk about how you do that after this section. So if I'm able to put it on someone right now, I'll bring it to +12. If I'm not, then I leave it in inventory at +9 just because of the mana management and, like, you know, the mana crunch right now. Like, I don't have enough mana to bring everything to +12 at the moment. Now, for my dungeon farming teams, every time I get an artifact that seems like it's somewhat even decently usable and it's got flat attack on it and it can fill the spot of a monster in a dungeon team that doesn't have an artifact, I take those to +15. Other than that, again, because I'm just managing mana right now, the only things I've been taking to +15 are the artifacts that I legitimately get excited about. I'm like, oh yeah, that's the one, baby. Those I take to +15. Everything else I'm leaving at +12 right now, because I am finding that I'm occasionally changing out artifacts as I get better versions. Or I'm shifting artifacts around onto different monsters as I get better versions, and maybe I don't want to take a +15 artifact that costs me 2 million mana and stick it on a deep siege box monster that I may not use again for 6 months. And now the last thing I want to talk about today is actually how do you decide which artifact to put on which monster? And there's kind of an easy trick for this, so I'm going to show you guys right now. Okay, so behind us is this website, Swore Farm. Now, for those of you who use the optimizer, you may actually be familiar with Swore Farm already, but you don't have to use the optimizer in order to use this website. So all you would do is just go to sworefarm.com. It's spelled like this, SWARFARM. So you go to sworefarm.com, and then you click on the Bestiary tab, which is a list of all the beasts or all the monsters in Summoner's War. Now, when you get to it, the page is going to look like this, and you just click on this button right here, Filters. And then the first thing I do is I go to Awakening level and I put Awakened, because it will search all of the monsters that are both awakened and unawakened, and it's the same results, it's just double of them. So by putting Awakened, you reduce the number of results. Now, I look at the artifact that I'm trying to figure out where I want to use it. Let's say it's an HP type artifact with skill 2 recovery. So I would come in here and I would go to Archetype, HP, and then I would go to Other Effects, and I would look for Heal, and I hit Apply. And now I've got a list of every HP type monster that can heal. And from here you have to have a little bit of game knowledge, because unfortunately you can't, at least that I know of, there's no way to filter it down specifically by skill. So if it's skill 2, I just have to scroll down and look at the monsters and say, okay, who heals on skill 2? Oh, Ritesh does. And I look at the Ritesh. Now, if you don't know what a skill does, you can just hover your mouse cursor over it. I didn't click or anything. I just hovered my mouse cursor. And this tells me on Kumar, removes harmful effects granted on yourself and recovers 40% of max HP. So we know that a recovery boosting artifact for skill 2 then is going to be a big deal. Now let's say the next artifact we want to put on somebody has flat attack as a stat, and it has additional damage by N%, by 120% of speed. So we know that those additional damage ones that are kind of like ignore defense, we want those on multi-hitters. And because it's got flat attack, we probably want it on a monster that scales to attack. So we come over here to Archetype, we look for attack, we go to number of hits, we click 3, we hit Apply, and then we scroll down and we can see here's Abigail, who's a multi-hitter, here's Antares, who's a multi-hitter, Argon, and you can scroll through the list and find the monster that's most appropriate. Now, because there are so many here, maybe I want to put this on a monster that does at least 5 hits. I can bring that slider back over, and I can hit Apply again. It's still a big list, so maybe I want a monster that does AoE attack. I can click on AoE right here, and on and on and on. So basically you can filter down to the exact monster that you're looking for. We've got a natural star filter here, so if we want to limit it to a 5-star monster. Now we've got this down to a relatively small list, and it sounds like Belager would be pretty good for this one because it would help you in your R5. And so that's going to be it for today's video, guys. I know it was a long video. I do have actually a couple of, this is kind of what I'm calling like the game progression series. I've got a couple of other topics that are going to be coming up in this series as well. They're going to tend to be slightly longer videos. They're a little bit harder to break up because there's so much new content. But as always, hope you enjoyed the video, hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next time. Hey guys, if you're still with me to this point, then that means that you probably liked the video, found it entertaining, or even better, both. So please smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment down below because those things help the channel grow, and more importantly, they show me that the video is useful, and that's the whole reason I do this in the first place.